Good morning, ladies and gents. I'm up and out early today on Sunday, as you've already just seen by the previous post, which I found very touching, I must say. We are at St Margaret's of Antioch Church and Churchyard in Barking, now in London, once Essex, and we're at the grave of Jane Young and the legend of the writing that will not go. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a sec. We've just heard the lovely church bells chiming. Clock face has been recently cleaned, so that looks all decent. Anyway, back to Jane Young and the reason why we're here. It's got the skull and crossbones at the top and the egg timers on either side. This seems absolutely morbid and awful to us to put on a grave nowadays, but in those days it basically was a message to the living to remind them that you're alive today but you could be dead tomorrow, so live well and be nice. That was the motto of it. Anyway, here lieth the body of Jane Young, the daughter of Edward and Mary Young of this parish, who departed this life the 20th of January 1689, aged 16 years and 3 months. So as you see, Jane was very young. From what records we can look at and find, I can't find any brothers or sisters of Jane, and her parents both lived and died in this parish, so they may have lost children as stillbirths or infants, because stillbirths weren't recorded in the burials in those days, because basically a child had to have been born, breathed and lived to have classed to have had a soul. So stillbirths were normally put in the coffin of a poor local woman or a local woman that you knew and something like that, and it wasn't even registered. But there we are. Anyway, so it's quite possible that Jane was an only child, and the legend goes that the grief of her parents was so bad that her father ordered the engraving and carving and writing on this stone to be carved so deep that it would never wear away. Now, this is a grave from 1689. These graves are from the 1700s, these ones, and these ones particularly here. These are from the late 1700s. These ones are also from the 1700s. This one started off in the 1600s and had more family buried in it in the 1700s and had a new top. Now, they're all made from slightly stronger or more resilient stone than Jane's grave here. And this is what has created the legend of the writing that will not go, because the writing hasn't worn away on Jane's grave, which gets just the same amount of weathering as these graves, and particularly this grave. I mean, some said it might be because of that protecting it, but it's not, because if you look, that's not protected that any, and Jane's is more open than that. And just here, by the way, a little point of interest, was one of the old entrances to the church in the right back in the, like, a good few hundred years ago. It's got a good strong history, this church. It belonged to an abbey, or was part of an abbey, which was over there, and there's 2 saints buried over there. But yeah, back to Jane Young, the legend of the writing that will not go. It's an interesting one, because this has never been recarved or engraved, yet the writing doesn't go away, and hence it's built up the little bit of the legend that her mother and father's grief was so deep that her father ordered the mason to carve the writing and the inscriptions so deep into the stone that it would never wear away and she would never be forgotten. And as you can see, I didn't put these here to this day, and no one knows who does it. Someone comes to this day about once a week and they still put fresh flowers on Jane Young. So there we have it, ladies and gentlemen, Jane Young and the legend of the writing that will not go. Second part of the video, we're just going to be having a little look at Jane's life and a little of Jane's world. I've been able to do a fair bit of genealogy on Jane. Found when she was christened, the day she was buried, when her parents were buried. So yeah, join me for that part now. Hope you're all enjoying this and enjoy what you're going to see. Join me now for part 2. Genealogy, or family history, being another one of my great hobbies, I went on to familysearch.org and was able to find out a fair bit on Jane and her parents. Here we start off at Jane's christening entry. Christened 17th of November 1673 in Barking St Margaret's, of course. In the early days, it wasn't until the latter 1600s and through the 1700s that many churches started to record the mother's name down on christening records. Before that, as you can see here with Jane's, only the father, Edward Young, is mentioned. I don't know why this occurred, and it's direly unfair and bloody annoying for anyone that's into their family history, because it means when you find a christening, you then have to find the parents' marriage to find out who the mother is. And that's not always easy, because if you had two John Youngs in the area and they both married two separate women, you'll not know whose is whose. So we feel fairly lucky in that we knew Jane's mother's name through the gravestone, which is Mary. This is Jane's electronic version of the christening entry, which is on familysearch.org. And this is the copy of the original baptism register. From that time, a bit blurry and whatnot, but here we are. This is all online genealogy. Gone are the days where you have to go to an archives and travel all over the place and find these things. Here we see Jane's burial entry. Jane died on the 20th of January and was buried 6 days later. Had she died in the summer, she would have been buried a lot quicker, for obvious reasons, in an age before many were embalmed, and won't go into too much detail, but there we are. Buried in St Margaret's, Barking, of course. Only the father's name registered again. The Reverend at the time was Reverend Edward Thomas. He would more than likely have performed the service, being that this was a family with a bit of money. The poor people, like many of my family, they got their services performed by the curate. Big thanks to my friend David from North Muskham in Nottingham, who's helped me with a few illustrations. This basically shows what a funeral of a girl like Jane of the time would have looked like. Everyone dressed in deepest mourning, the coffin carried on shoulders, covered in a great black pall, and believe it or not, even the bearers of the coffin were covered over with that pall as well, so goodness knows how they saw their way around and didn't fall over, but that's the way it was done. And there you see the Reverend waiting at the church gate to greet the family and the deceased. What would a girl of Jane look like? What would her life have been like? Here we see an illustration of a girl of Jane's age from the time in her home. This was in a very chauvinistic age, shall we say, where women's role was in the home, and from a very early age Jane would have been trained by her mother, grandmother, possibly sisters, older if they were around, aunts, how to run a home, how to care for children, how to be a good wife. And as a tradesman's daughter, her father would have tried to marry her to a tradesman or a tradesman's son, so she would have had certain learnings and aspects in her father's trade as well. Was able to find a little bit out on Edward. Being a tradesman, he was a freeman, and it turns out that his trade was a tallow chandler. That's dealing in animal fats and waxes and everything like that. It doesn't sound very glamorous or well paid, but in an age before electric lighting, that was the only source of lighting, was the beeswax for the rich and the tallow candles for the poor, and whale oil sometimes for those that could afford it and could bide the smell of it. But this shows what Jane would have looked like in her home, just preparing some food and doing what girls would have done back then. Here we've been able to find Edward, Jane's father, when he was buried. And he died a good few years after Jane, and was buried in 1703 on the 23rd of June. No age is recorded in those days, but going by how old Jane was and possibly how old the parents were when they had Jane, they seem to have probably been in their 50s or 60s, which was a fairly good innings for that age, when the average life expectancy was 45 for a man and about 30 to 35 for a woman in a lot of cases, because childbirth was dangerous in those days and it killed a hell of a lot of women. Here's the original page with the burial entries for Edward in 1703, all neatly noted down. And here we see the electronic entry for Jane's mother, Mary, and she was buried on the 17th of September 1713, so she would definitely have been in her 60s, possibly even a little older. Strange thing is, I can't find any other children of Jane's parents, so I'm wondering if Jane was the only child, and that would explain the great loss that they felt, and maybe explain the legend of the writing that will not go, because you lose your only child, you may well order the stone or ask the stonemason to carve that writing so deep that it would never wear away. So there we are, ladies and gentlemen. You have Jane Young and the writing that will not go. Hope you'll find that interesting.